Hello, welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. U.S. President Donald Trump has reignited his trade war. 92 countries have been hit with new tariff rates ranging from 10% to 40%. The new rates are set to take effect from the 7th of August. India is facing the highest tariffs in the region. The new rate for Bangladesh has been reduced from 35% earlier to 20%. Pakistan faces a 19% tariff and Afghanistan is the lowest with 15%. India is also staring at the highest tariff rate among developing economies in Asia. Vietnam faces 20%, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines all face a 19% tariff rate. President Trump has also vowed to penalize India for doing business with Russia, but has not clarified on the specifics. Sources tell us that the White House has been eyeing greater access for American products in India's dairy and agriculture markets. Indian government sources told CNBC TV 18 that they will never compromise on the interests of farmers. However, the government will continue to negotiate with the U.S. due to their robust strategic partnership. In a press conference, External Affairs Ministry spokesperson Randhir Jaiswal has said India's partnership with the U.S. has weathered several challenges and New Delhi is confident of continuing the relationship moving forward. He also pointed at the potential to grow the defense relationship and energy relationship even further.
India and the United States share a comprehensive global strategic partnership anchored in shared interests, democratic values, and robust people-to-people ties. This partnership has weathered several transitions and challenges. We remain focused on the substantive agenda that the two countries have committed to and are confident that the relationship will continue to move forward. We have strong ties with the United States. These ties have strengthened over the last several years and decades. There is potential for this partnership to grow further under the India U.S. Compact for the 21st century.
We're now joined by Philip Luck, Director of the Economics Programs at CSIS. Mr. Luck is also the former Deputy Chief Economist for the U.S. State Department. We're also joined by Humayun Falakshahi, Head of Crude Oil Analysis at Kepler, and Thomas Matthew, former bureaucrat who served as Deputy DG at the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. Mr. Matthew is also a security analyst. Thank you very much for being with us on the program. Philip Luck, if I can begin with you. You know, U.S. has been investing in the India partnership for the last so many years as a buffer to China. What has gone wrong so seriously that Donald Trump has used this kind of language for the Indian government, saying that Russia and India are dead economies, they can go down together for all I care, then saying that we're going to penalize India with very harsh tariffs. Why would he use this kind of language for India? What's gone wrong? What's he so upset about? And what is the U.S. really seeking from the trade deal?
It's a great question. I mean, I think I would certainly start by saying this seems to be frustration, not strategy. And we're seeing this replicated across many of other trading partners. I mean, if you think about critical minerals, Canada is going to be an incredibly important partner for our critical mineral supply chains. We are doing everything to disrupt those productive relationships. I think the exact same thing is true here with India. The last thing I would say is, you know, I think some of the problems that we're having, the administration clearly wants to be opening up markets for U.S. ag. A problem there is the reason they need markets for U.S. ag is because due to other trade tensions, other markets are shutting down. So exactly the sticking points that we have with India right now are in some sense self-created because of other challenges that we've created for ourselves.
Right. You know, just to speak to you about agriculture and dairy, you know, top government officials have briefed journalists here and they said that there can be no compromise on agriculture and dairy because almost 60 to 70% of our population is into farming. And these are farmers with very small land parcels. It's very difficult for India to give any concessions, and this would be a non-negotiable. And is agriculture and dairy really what U.S. wants? Because on one hand, Donald Trump, Phil, says that India is a very small trading partner. We don't do too much trade with them. Is this about agriculture and dairy, or is it about bigger oil and defense contracts?
It's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, it certainly is the case that people have indicated to the president, or they've gotten into his ear and said that these barriers are things that have to come down. But to your point, I don't think there's a proper appreciation for the fact that these are non-negotiable. These are things that are incredibly difficult to do, and the concessions that we would have to make, which of course we're not willing to, would have to be enormous to sort of offset the implications for the Indian economy. To your point, there are areas of compromise. I mean, there are rather mutual benefit, whether it be through continuing to increase our defense cooperation or oil and gas and other areas. The other area I would say, of course, I do think even though they didn't put a tariff on India for its imports of oil above the price cap from Russia, I do think if there was some ability to make movement there, that could really help.
Right. Let me go across to Humayun Falak on that question. Humayun, we are telling the United States that we have a diversified crude partnership. Our energy partnership with the U.S. is strong. We are going to buy $25 billion worth of oil and gas from the U.S. this year. But we have to keep in mind geopolitics and market demand and market conditions. To what extent are you seeing India's import of Russian energy go down? Do you significantly see India's energy imports from U.S. going up?
Hi, Rachel. Thanks for having me. I think, to an extent, imports from from Russia into India have been relatively stable year on year. So, as you know, India emerged as one of the largest buyers of Russian crude after the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the imports went up from 30,000 barrels per day back in 2021 to 1.8 million barrels per day. So far this year, we're still at these levels. We're slightly under on a year-on-year basis. We're only down by about 50,000 barrels per day. But it's true that in July, we have seen a big drop in imports into India of Russian crude. But it's also down from a very high level back in June. So in June, we saw more than 2 million barrels per day of imports, actually. And there's been a 500,000 barrels per day drop in July. This could be the beginning of something, as you mentioned that India could shift some of its crude diet more towards, let's say, countries like the Middle East or even the U.S. as well. So it's true that we've seen an increase in oil imports from the U.S., but in terms of volumes and the magnitude of the shifts, it's far from being sufficient, I would say, in the Indian market. So, we have seen a drop of 500 KBD, 500,000 barrels per day from Russia. And on the other side, we have seen an increase of 100,000 barrels per day from the U.S. And looking forward, given the U.S. has a very diversified export market, the U.S. cannot really replace Russia in the Indian market. We could see imports from the U.S. go to as high, I would say, as 300,000 barrels per day, which is another 100,000 barrels per day on top of what is currently being achieved. But it's hard to see it go a lot higher, considering all the different characteristics of U.S. crude as well, which is quite different in terms of quality compared to Russian crude.
That brings me to my next question. To what extent have you seen a growth, a jump in India's import of U.S. crude, U.S. LNG since February this year, and logistically speaking, and complementarities in crude refineries, price-wise, can U.S. actually replace Russian crude, and will India be able to stop buying Russian crude altogether?
So the answer to your very last question really depends on the extent of the U.S. action against Russia here. Whether it's going to be secondary sanctions being imposed, whether it's secondary tariffs, it makes a difference. Or even, as we think at Kepler, we believe that this is mainly a negotiating tactic from the Trump administration, and at the end of the day, there will be an agreement to continue import oil from Russia to an extent. Secondary sanctions, of course, I think this is the kind of bazooka option from the Trump administration. It would mean that all Indian refiners would suddenly need to stop imports from Russia. Secondary tariffs, I think it's still quite debatable, and we could still see some imports from Russia. Looking at the imports from the U.S., we have seen, again, an increase since the beginning of the year. And if you compare, for example, with 2024 and 2023, there has been an increase of about 100,000 barrels per day in the past 2 years to about 200,000 barrels per day on average so far this year. Actually, the past 2-3 months, we have been closer to 270,000 barrels per day from the US. But again, if you look at this magnitude, it's far from being able to replace Russian crude in the Indian market, which is 6 times higher in terms of volumes. The fact that the US, needs to export to different markets as well, mean that it cannot be replacing Russia on its own in the Indian market. However, India can also turn to the Middle East and to West Africa, for example. We have seen the spread between Brent and Dubai come down. So it means that crude from the likes of West Africa and Brazil are becoming more attractive to Indian buyers. But I think it would still be a problem because the Russian share in the Indian market is still at 37%. And so that's a huge chunk to replace, and it will come at high cost if it has to be.
Right. Let me go across to Mr. Thomas Matthew. Mr. Thomas Matthew, as someone who has watched India-US relations for a long time, is there still room for some creative negotiations and diplomacy? How do you find a way around your red lines? You've got a US president saying that you have to give me unprecedented access or I'm going to hit you with secondary tariffs, and those could come as early as the next 10 days. If the Russia-Ukraine talks were to fail, there could be more penalties on India. What options does India have?
Yeah, Parishit, firstly, thank you for having me on this talk. Now, let me tell you, India is in a slightly precarious position here. You have Trump, who is very unrestrained in both his actions and talk, and he will walk his talk. If you see what has happened to UK, you should understand the Anglo-Saxon country has always been the closest to the United States. And even with regard to UK, he has negotiated a very tough deal and got several concessions from UK. And he has reduced the tariffs to 10%. Another strategic partner like Japan, he has imposed 15%, and EU, the largest trading bloc, also 15%. Now, can India defy Trump? My answer is no, India cannot. Now, if India were to be penalized for importing Russian oil, it would actually impact India's economy substantially. We need to accept that the US is the giant in the world market. It's about 26% of the world GDP. And plus India's exports to US and India's trade with the US is about 18 to 20% of its total trade. So India cannot do without the US. But at the same time, I think India will have to take a principled stand and negotiate very carefully, pampering to, if I may say, Mr. Trump's ego. The whole shift in Trump's strategy with regard to Russia, I'm told, happened because Melania Trump's influence on Trump, and there's been a sudden shift saying that the Russian president, who was considered to be very savvy, very smart by Trump, has suddenly become his nemesis. Now, if he's going to take a tough stance with regard to Russia, you need to understand that we are importing, as Mr. Homayan said, we are importing close to 30 to 37 to 40% of our needs from Russia. And that's about $50 billion. Can you change overnight? You cannot. You will probably be able to spread your intake to other countries over a period of time. But if Trump takes a tough stance, you will be compelled to enter into some kind of negotiated settlement. If EU has been compelled, if Japan has been compelled, if UK, the closest ally of the US, has been compelled, then I think India has no choice. India will have to negotiate very subtly with the US administration. Although the stance of Trump administration, according to me, is completely irrational from many points of view.
Right. Mr. Matthew, I want to speak to you about the defense partnership because that's the other irritant in talks. I'm going to take a break, but I'll request all our guests to stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You are watching Global Eye, and we continue to focus on the India-US trade ties in light of some sharp criticism from Donald Trump. We still have with us Philip Luck of CSIS, Humayun Falakshahi of Kipler, and defense expert and someone who has worked across the Finance Ministry, the Industries Ministry and the Defense Ministry in India, Mr. Thomas Matthew. Mr. Matthew, speaking about the defense relationship, you know, 72% of our defense inventory is of Russian origin. Our defense imports from Russia have been going down, but can we significantly increase our defense imports from US? Is the US seeking, according to you, most favored defense supplier status from India? Can India do that?
Yeah, Parishad, that's a very tricky question. That's a difficult question. That's a very important question. If you really asked me, I've been a person who's been critical about importing American equipment, US equipment. And why do I say it? I say it because if you import American equipment, you can only fight the wars you want the US to us to fight. On the other hand, Russia has been the most dependable ally of this country, starting from the 1971 war. And please understand, the US weapons are subject to technology denial regime. While on the other hand, Russia has been more than forthcoming in transferring technology to India. Whether you talk about the nuclear submarines, whether you talk about shipbuilding, whether you talk about missiles, in comparison to Russia, US has not been a dependable defense partner, nor will it be, because of the tight technological control regime they have. In fact, they do not have much history of co-production, except in some of the European countries and also in UK. So therefore, shifting to American weapons would do India bad, according to me, because these weapons cannot be utilized or put into action unless the US says, go in and use them. This is the basic problem. And I don't know, India is going to face a tough question, how it will be able to evolve a strategy to keep Trump happy, at the same time, keep India's preparedness intact. For instance, S-400, the missile, the defense missile, surface-to-air missile, which proved its potency. So similarly, we have nuclear submarines, we have all kinds of weapons from Russia. You don't want a supplier who will control the equipment which you buy, which you pay money for. This is the problem which we are going to face.
Right, that's a very important point. Let me go back to our guest from CSIS, Mr. Phil Luck. Phil, just to ask you, what's going to happen now over the next few weeks? And what we saw during the Biden administration, and you were a part of the Biden administration, there were tariffs on steel, aluminium that were imposed by Donald Trump. There were some China tariffs that were imposed. Joe Biden and his administration kept those tariffs on. They did not change that economic policy, so to say. They added their own. They had their own legacy. But it's not like they completely did away with the kind of tariffs Donald Trump had. Is there a danger that if India is not able to have a deal with the US, then the tariffs that are imposed by Donald Trump now may stay even with the next US administration?
I think that's a real concern and something that I've been thinking about more recently. I think, look, tariffs are very hard to take off once you've put them on. There's a protected constituency who really wants those tariffs in place and is going to lobby quite hard to keep them in place. When we had the tariffs on China, when we came in the Biden administration, there was a lot of talk about how to make those more strategic, how to lower them in certain areas where we could import more from China and increase them in areas where it was strategically important to do so. That really didn't happen. We weren't able to reduce tariffs because of the sort of pull of keeping protection in place. The other thing I would note is, these are not an enormous source of revenue relative to overall government revenue. The tariffs we're looking at now maybe be about 5% of government revenue. That's still about $200 billion. So anybody who lowers tariffs from here is going to have to answer the question, where are you getting $200 billion, or are you borrowing it? Now, of course, we're borrowing far more than that, but I agree with you that, overall, this big tariff regime, the longer it stays in place, the more difficult it's going to be to move back to anything close to our pre-Trump 2.0 tariff regime.
Right. Coming to you, Humayun Falakshahi, when it comes to India's imports, could you give us a sense, if you had to quantify in value terms, what would be the value of our imports, oil and gas imports from US since the start of this year versus Russia? And in terms of certain long-term contracts that you're tracking, are you getting a sense that Indian energy companies are signing major long-term oil and gas contracts with US entities?
Yeah, so I mean, when it comes to the value of imports, so specifically looking at the oil side of things, as Mr. Matthews mentioned, it's more or less from Russia, it's more or less around $50 billion. It's actually slightly under that, around 45, 46. Again, if we compare in terms of volumes to the US, imports from Russia are about 5 to 6 times higher. So in terms of value from the US, it would be around, I would say about $7 billion in terms of oil. Now that said, Russia's oil is slightly discounted, so this is also to take into account. But more or less around $7-8 billion when it comes to oil. When you look at LNG, the volume actually from the imports from the US have decreased so far into India. They have almost halved. And that's mainly due to, it's not linked to the recent skirmishes between New Delhi and Washington. It's mostly linked to the LNG market and the fact that the prices in Europe have been more attractive for US producers. So they have been shipping more of their LNG to Europe. If you take that into account, then more or less the total traded value of energy between the US and India, I mean, oil and liquefied natural gas is around $10 billion, so a lot less than what India imports from Russia. And I'm sorry, if you could repeat your second question, that slipped out of my mind. I'm sorry.
Right. Any visibility outlook on certain long-term contracts with US entities? Are you seeing that between India and US entities?
Not really, no. I mean, you look at the refinery landscape in India, usually they have a lot of term contracts signed with the likes of Middle Eastern countries. And also recently, Reliance and Naira have had term commitments with the Russians. Excuse me. With the US, it hasn't been really the case so far. I think we could be in a situation where if there's a trade deal that is signed, it could be a promise that the Indian players, the importers, the refiners, pledge potentially to the US administration that, we pledge to increase our buying from the US and potentially even sign term commitments, meaning that there is a certain level of flows, a minimum level of flows that US producers would be able and would be certain to ship to India. It's something that could take place, but so far we haven't heard anything like that.
Right. Mr. Matthew, coming to you, do you now expect that if we don't have this trade deal, we could be looking at a prolonged phase of SAARD relations between India and United States? And secondly, in terms of market sentiment on the financial sector, on the stock markets, if you don't have this deal and you have tariffs, which put you in a disadvantageous position. If I look at the tariff chart now, we have the highest tariffs in South Asia. How do you think the investor sentiment will be on India if we don't have this deal and India-US relations were to worsen here on?
Parshit, more than the 25% tariff, I'm worried about the additional tariff that will be imposed if India does not reduce its dependency on Russia, both for defense equipment as also with regard to oil. That's the catch here. And knowing Trump, one morning he will wake up and then play golf, and sitting in his cart, he will say, okay, from tomorrow, I'm going to impose 200% tax on India, or 300% tax, or 500% additional tax. That's the worry. Now, you need to understand India's total trade with the US as a percentage of US trade in goods is only about 2.4 or 2.3%. That's not substantial. But for India, it is substantial. But if the 25% continues to hold, then it's going to adversely affect Indian economy. There is absolutely no doubt with regard to that. See, almost 20% of India's total export goes to the US. And there are certain areas like pharmaceutical and gems where the percentage would slowly rise to 28 to 29 to 30%. So India will have to, play smart with Trump, and negotiating with Trump to strike a deal is a sine qua non, is a non-brainer as far as I'm concerned. I may not agree with Mr. Luck when he says that if this tariff continues, then it will become the new norm. That may not happen. You cannot compare China and India. Biden continued some of the policies of Trump because China is the big threat to the US, whether it comes to the chips or whether it comes to defense. But as far as India is concerned, you need to understand, except for Trump, many other American presidents have appreciated the need to strengthen India because of the democratic dividend the world will get if India becomes actually an emblem of success of democratic values. The US always speak about India's pluralistic society. They speak about India being the largest democracy.
Okay.
And in many ways, India's democracy is stronger than the American democracy. It's more vibrant than the American democracy because American democracy is primarily controlled by pressure groups and lobbies. While in India, it's more down to the root. So India has got something like a better form of, I won't call it direct democracy, but better democracy. But the US should be doing that. But unfortunately for Trump, he is like an old-time 15th century British mercantilist, That's what he looks like. He looks at the world not in terms of geostrategic perspective. Now, Bush gave India exception. If you remember, Jimmy
Matthew, I'm running out of time.
Sorry. Yeah. Okay.
Mr. Matthew, I'm unfortunately running out of time, but I really appreciate your views. And there is hope in India, and what we are told by sources that the government is going to try and negotiate and find a way out because it's just too important a relationship to sacrifice like this. But Phil Luck, Humayun Falak-Shahi, Thomas Matthew, thank you very much for joining us on the program. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.